The Two Babylons posits a controversial and sweeping historical claim that many doctrines and practices of the modern Roman Catholic Church are, in fact, not scriptural, but are direct inheritances from the ancient pagan religion of Babylon. Published in 1853, the book traces symbols, rituals, and deities from the worship of the mother and child to son reverence, arguing they have merely been rebranded into Christian forms. This deep historical critique remains a landmark work in Protestant polemics, challenging readers to distinguish true Christian faith from what Hislop alleges are corrupting pagan accretions. Although Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons failed to gain serious recognition among 19th-century historians, its influence on modern theology is undeniable. Within certain evangelical and fundamentalist circles, the book's central thesis, that Catholicism is a disguised continuation of ancient Babylonian paganism, is widely accepted. It continues to fuel polemical debates, particularly regarding the supposed pagan origins of Christmas, Easter, and the doctrine of the Trinity. However, modern scholarship universally disregards Hislop's work, citing a reliance on weak analogies and historical inaccuracies. The book is now studied primarily as a historical example of anti-Catholic rhetoric, rather than a credible source on comparative religion. The practical influence of Hislop's The Two Babylons is most evident in the daily practices of fundamentalist evangelical groups. Hislop's allegations, particularly those concerning the pagan roots of holidays, spurred many Protestants to reject traditional Christian celebrations. Within these communities, elements like the Christmas tree, Easter eggs, and even certain church architectural styles are often shunned as corrupt traditions derived from ancient idolatry. This creates a strong emphasis on a strict, scripture-only approach, aiming for a perceived purity of worship. By providing a ready-made historical framework for doctrinal differences, Hislop's theories became a foundational text for identity formation, sharply defining separatist Christian communities against the backdrop of broader religious history. Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons provided a crucial historical justification for the emerging biblical literalism and fundamentalist movements. The book strengthened the radical commitment to sola scriptura, the principle that the Bible alone is the infallible rule of faith. Hislop's work fostered a deep suspicion of all historical interpretation and church authority, suggesting that centuries of tradition had corrupted the faith. This provided the fundamentalist movement with a compelling narrative. To truly follow Christ, one must bypass history and tradition entirely, clinging only to a plain, literal, and inerrant reading of the Scriptures. Alexander Hislop's polemic, The Two Babylons, served as a powerful historical tool to cement the supremacy of sola scriptura within the Protestant identity. Hislop argued that religious traditions, particularly those associated with the Roman Catholic Church, were fundamentally pagan, a direct inheritance from ancient Babylon. By systematically exposing these origins, Hislop presented tradition not as an aid to faith, but as a dangerous contamination. Consequently, Hislop's work armed the literalist movement with the intellectual ammunition needed to demand an absolute return to the Bible as the sole, untainted source of authority for belief and practice. Hislop's assertion that Catholic practices were Babylonian paganism provided a dramatic, pseudo-historical basis for the evangelical focus on sola scriptura. This argument wasn't just theological. It had practical consequences. It drove the widespread rejection of icons and statues, deemed forms of pagan idolatry, leading to a focus on simple, unadorned worship spaces. Furthermore, Hislop's claims about the pagan origins of holidays like Christmas and Easter armed conservative evangelicals with justification to avoid these corrupt celebrations, ultimately by discrediting church tradition as Babylonian. Hislop forced a profound commitment to the Bible as the only trustworthy guide, reinforcing the literal, non-contextual interpretation central to the fundamentalist identity. Hislop's influence on the rejection of traditional Christian holidays by fundamentalist groups is one of his most visible legacies. In The Two Babylons, he meticulously argued that both Christmas and Easter were adopted from ancient pagan rituals, Christmas from Roman Saturnalia and sun worship, and Easter from the cult of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. For movements adhering strictly to sola scriptura, this historical claim provided the necessary proof that these celebrations were not scriptural, but rather relics of idolatry. This led to a strong push within these groups to abandon holiday customs like the Christmas tree and Easter eggs, viewing such practices as unacceptable compromises with paganism. Hislop thus provided the historical validation needed for a conscious, systematic separation from mainstream Christian tradition in pursuit of perceived biblical purity. Beyond the theological arguments, Hislop's influence profoundly shaped the emotional and social landscape of fundamentalist families. The resolute avoidance of Christmas and Easter, framed as a duty to spiritual purity, often came at a significant human cost. Children watched wistfully as neighbors celebrated, leading to feelings of profound social isolation and otherness. This separation created internal tension between cultural belonging and spiritual obedience. However, this very sacrifice, the conscious decision to forego tradition and mainstream culture, was often reinterpreted within these communities as a badge of honor, a visible and emotionally intense mark of their commitment to a literal, uncontaminated faith defined by Hislop's historical claims. The adoption of Hislop's anti-pagan thesis had a direct, irreversible impact on the creation and maintenance of family traditions. In communities that rigorously followed the principles of holiday avoidance, the multi-generational rituals associated with Christmas and Easter were simply lost. Families had no Christmas tree to decorate, no traditional holiday meals to prepare, and no Easter egg hunts to pass down. These voids forced them to substitute these mainstream cultural anchors with new, often simple and strictly non-traditional activities focused solely on scriptural study or general fellowship. The result is a family legacy marked not by the continuity of widely recognized celebrations, but by the deliberate Hislop-inspired separation, generating a distinct cultural identity forged from the rejection of what was deemed Babylonian tradition. The mandate to avoid traditional holidays, stemming from Hislop's claims of pagan origin, often created significant emotional distance, not just from the outside world, but within the family unit itself. During festive seasons, families committed to avoidance face social isolation, feeling like outsiders while the culture around them engages in communal celebration. This isolation can foster internal relational strain, particularly between generations, as younger members grapple with the sense of loss and the stigma of non-participation. The adherence to purity becomes a psychological barrier, causing deep feelings of otherness and requiring constant rejustification. Thus, the practical impact of Hislop's work is not only theological but deeply relational, forging a distinct identity through the emotional sacrifice of cultural conformity. Hislop's historical critique of holidays became a major source of generational tension within the families that adopted his strict sola scriptura application. For the generation that chose to adopt the non-celebration doctrine, the abstinence was a conscious, principled stand against what they perceived as pagan compromise. However, for their children and grandchildren, this stance often feels less like a choice and more like an imposed isolation. Younger generations, exposed to mainstream culture, frequently struggle with the enforced rejection of universal holiday traditions, leading to silent conflicts and resentments. The elders insist on the theological purity mandated by Hislop's findings, while the youth yearn for cultural connection. This creates an emotional chasm, where the family's identity, built on historical prohibition, becomes the very source of their internal division and relational strain. For the younger members in fundamentalist families, the legacy of Hislop's anti-holiday doctrine manifests as a heavy cultural burden. They must constantly navigate the tension between their inherent desire for belonging and the family's theological requirement for separation. This involves the perpetual labor of self-policing, ensuring compliance with non-celebration rules, and the challenging social work of explaining their difference to peers. The absence of traditional, emotionally rich holiday rituals leaves a void, often replaced by a stricter adherence to non-festive, somber religious observance. They inherit not a tradition of joy, but a tradition of refusal. This continuous vigilance and the emotional cost of being perpetually other during key cultural moments defines their unique experience, making Hislop's historical critique an intensely personal generational cross to bear.